My name is Lucas Miller, and this is a story I've never told anyone before. I'm not even sure if I should be sharing it now, but the weight of it has become unbearable. Maybe putting it into words will help me understand what happened that night and why I've never felt the same since. It was a late October evening when it all began, the kind of night where the wind cuts through your clothes and the moon hangs low, casting long shadows that seem to have a life of their own. I had been out with some friends, just a casual evening at the pub, nothing out of the ordinary. We laughed, shared stories, and eventually, the night began to wind down. I decided to walk home, needing the fresh air to clear my head. The streets were deserted. The only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves skittering across the pavement. The path I took was one I'd walked countless times before, through a quiet neighborhood, past the old church, and down the lane that led to my small apartment. But that night, something felt different. There was an unease in the air, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. As I turned the corner near the church, I noticed a figure standing under the flickering street lamp. He was tall, his face obscured by the shadow of a hood pulled low. He wore a black jacket that seemed to absorb the light, a void in the otherwise dimly lit street. I don't know why, but something about him made my skin crawl. I quickened my pace, not wanting to make eye contact, hoping to pass by unnoticed. But as I drew closer, the man stepped out from under the lamp, his face still hidden, and began to walk in my direction. My heart raced, and I could feel a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. There was something about the way he moved, deliberate, almost predatory, that sent a shiver down my spine. I kept my head down, trying to convince myself that I was being paranoid, that this was just some random guy out for a late-night stroll. But as he got closer, I could sense his eyes on me, watching, studying. The air around me grew colder, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes you feel like you'll never be warm again. I passed him without incident, but I could feel his presence lingering behind me. I didn't dare look back. My footsteps quickened into a near jog as I made my way down the lane. The feeling of being watched didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger. Then I heard it. Footsteps echoing mine. He was following me. Panic surged through me. I broke into a run, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The sound of his footsteps quickened too, matching my pace. I could feel him gaining on me, closing the distance between us. My mind raced, searching for a way out, but the lane was long, and there was nowhere to go. Finally, my apartment came into view. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door unlocked. The footsteps were right behind me now. I could feel his presence, so close I could almost hear his breath. The door finally gave way, and I threw myself inside, slamming it shut and locking it behind me. I pressed my back against the door, heart pounding, trying to catch my breath. The footsteps stopped, but the silence that followed was even more terrifying. I looked through the peephole, expecting to see him standing there, but the street was empty. The man in the black jacket was gone, vanished into the night as if he had never been there. But the fear didn't leave me. It clung to me like a second skin, a constant reminder that something was out there, watching, waiting. For weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. I would catch glimpses of him in crowds, feel his eyes on me when I was alone. But every time I looked, he was gone, a phantom haunting the edges of my vision. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I can still feel his presence, even now, all these years later. I've moved across the country, changed my name, tried to forget that night, but I can't. Because every now and then, when I'm walking alone at night, I hear it, the sound of footsteps echoing mine, and I know he's still out there, wearing that black jacket, waiting for me, and one day I know he'll catch up.
My name is Ethan Reed, and I've always been skeptical about ghost stories, until I experienced one myself. This isn't just a tale to scare you, it's a warning. There are places in this world where the past lingers, where the shadows hold secrets, and sometimes it's better to leave them alone. It was the summer after my grandfather passed away. I was tasked with cleaning out his old farm, a place I hadn't visited since I was a kid. The farm was nestled deep in the countryside, surrounded by miles of fields and dense woods. The house was in decent shape, but the barn the barn was different. The barn had always given me an uneasy feeling, even when I was young. It was a massive, weathered structure, its wooden boards warped and cracked with age. The roof sagged in places, and the once red paint had faded to a dull, sickly brown. No one had been inside it for years. At least, that's what I thought. As I walked up to the barn, the air around it felt heavier, colder. The wind seemed to die down, and the usual sounds of the countryside, birds, insects, rustling leaves, faded away, leaving an oppressive silence. I hesitated, my hand on the rusted latch, before finally pushing the creaking door open. Inside, the barn was dark, the only light coming from narrow beams that pierced through the gaps in the wooden walls. Dust motes floated in the air, disturbed by my presence. The smell of old hay and decaying wood filled my nostrils, but there was something else too, a faint, acrid odor that I couldn't quite place. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I began to explore. Old farming tools were scattered around, covered in dust and cobwebs. The floor was littered with debris, and the rafters above were home to countless birds' nests. But it wasn't the disrepair that bothered me. It was the feeling that I wasn't alone. In the far corner of the barn, I noticed something odd, a large, heavy trapdoor set into the floor. I didn't remember ever seeing it before, but then again, I hadn't spent much time in the barn as a child. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. The trapdoor was heavy, but I managed to pry it open, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading down into the earth. A musty, cold draft blew up from the depths, carrying that same acrid smell, stronger now. I hesitated, a voice in the back of my mind telling me to close the door and leave, but I ignored it. I had to know what was down there. I grabbed a flashlight from my truck and descended the stairs, each step creaking ominously under my weight. The air grew colder as I went deeper, and the smell became almost unbearable, a mix of rot and something metallic. Finally, I reached the bottom, my flashlight beam cutting through the thick darkness. What I saw stopped me in my tracks. The basement was large, far larger than I had expected. The walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves were jars, hundreds of them, filled with murky liquid and what looked like small, twisted objects suspended inside. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing, but as I moved closer, the horrific reality dawned on me. The jars contained remains, preserved organs, bones, and other things I couldn't identify. Some were clearly animal, but others looked disturbingly human. My stomach churned, and I felt bile rise in my throat. As I stood there, horrified, I heard something behind me, a faint, shuffling sound. I spun around, my flashlight beam sweeping across the room, but there was nothing there. The sound came again, closer this time, and then I saw it. In the shadows, near the staircase, a figure stood watching me. It was tall and thin, its body twisted in unnatural ways. Its eyes gleamed in the darkness, reflecting the beam of my flashlight. For a moment, I was frozen with fear, unable to move as it slowly crept toward me. The figure stepped into the light, and I saw it clearly, a gaunt skeletal thing with skin stretched tight over its bones. Its mouth hung open in a silent scream, and its eyes were filled with rage, with a hunger that made my blood run cold. I turned and ran, scrambling up the stairs as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. Behind me, I could hear the thing following, its footsteps unnaturally fast, gaining on me with every second. I burst out of the trapdoor, slamming it shut behind me and throwing a heavy crate on top for good measure. I didn't stop running until I was in my truck, speeding away from the farm as fast as the old engine would allow. In the rearview mirror, the barn stood ominously in the distance. The trapdoor still closed, but I knew that whatever I had seen wasn't trapped down there. It was free now, and I had no idea what it would do next. I've never gone back to the farm, and I never will. I sold the property as soon as I could, but I never told anyone about the basement, about the jars, or about the thing I saw. Some secrets are better left buried, and some places are better left forgotten. But every now and then, I have nightmares of that barn, of the trapdoor, and of the thing that lurked in the darkness, waiting for me.
My name is Jacob Lawson, and I've been blind for as long as I can remember. It's not something I dwell on. I've learned to navigate the world without sight, relying on my other senses to fill in the gaps. But recently, something happened that made me question everything I thought I knew about the darkness I live in. It started on a quiet evening at home. I was alone, as I often am, listening to the soft hum of my apartment. The ticking of the old clock on the wall, the distant sound of traffic outside, and the comforting rhythmic breathing of my guide dog Max were all familiar to me. They formed the backdrop of my life, a world built from sound and touch. That evening, though, something changed. It began with a feeling, a cold, creeping sensation at the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. I dismissed it at first, thinking it was just my imagination, but the feeling grew stronger, more intense until it was impossible to ignore. Max, usually calm and steady, started to whimper softly. He nudged my leg, his fur bristling under my hand. I could tell he was uneasy, but I couldn't understand why. There was no sound, no strange smell, nothing to indicate that anything was wrong. And yet, the air felt different, thicker, colder. I stood up, my cane tapping the floor as I moved through the room, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. But no matter where I went, it followed me, like a shadow that I couldn't escape. I reached out, feeling the familiar textures of the furniture, the walls, but everything seemed off, wrong somehow. Then I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, just on the edge of my hearing. It was so soft that I thought I might be imagining it, but as I strained to listen, it became clearer. It wasn't words, not exactly, but a sound, a low, murmuring hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. My heart started to race, my breaths coming in shallow gasps. I turned my head, trying to locate the source of the sound, but it shifted, moving around me like a predator circling its prey. Max growled low in his throat, a sound I had never heard from him before. I backed up, my cane tapping the floor faster now, my movements more frantic. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and I felt something brush against my arm, something cold and damp. I recoiled, my skin crawling with a sensation I couldn't describe. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to stay calm. There was no response, just that endless whispering, growing louder, more chaotic, until it filled my head, drowning out everything else. I felt something else then, a presence, something tangible in the room with me. It was close, too close, and the air around me grew colder, like ice settling into my bones. I turned in its direction, my hand outstretched, but all I felt was empty air. Then, without warning, the whispering stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, a void that seemed to swallow up the world. I stood there, frozen in place, every nerve in my body on edge, waiting for something, anything to happen. And then, in that silence, I heard a voice. It was clear, unmistakable, and it spoke directly into my mind. "I see you, Jacob." I gasped, stumbling back, my legs nearly giving out beneath me. The voice was like nothing I had ever heard before. Cold, devoid of emotion, and yet somehow familiar. It echoed in my head, repeating the same phrase over and over. "I see you." I tried to respond, to ask who or what it was, but my voice caught in my throat. My hands shook, my pulse pounded in my ears, and all I could do was stand there, paralyzed by fear. Max whimpered again, pressing against my leg, and I could feel his body trembling as much as mine was. Whatever this thing was, it was real, and it was here, in my home, in my world of darkness. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually, the cold began to recede, the air slowly warming back to normal. The presence faded, and the whispering was gone, leaving only the familiar sounds of my apartment. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't really gone. It was still there, watching me, waiting. And the most terrifying part was that, somehow, it could see me, even in the darkness. I've tried to convince myself that it was just a hallucination, a trick of my mind. But I can't shake the feeling that something has changed. I've always lived in a world without sight, but now I feel like I'm being watched by something that sees more than I ever could. I still hear the voice sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet and still. It's always the same, repeating those 3 words over and over. A chilling reminder that in the darkness, I am never truly alone. I see you, Jacob.